Okay, so August is always an exciting time here at the Society, primarily because we look so forward to presenting this lecture series to the community. We've hosted the lecture series every year since 1990, and I hope you will all agree that it's been wonderfully revitalized over the past 5 years by our curator, Mimi Rogers. We always also look forward to August because it's a time when schools go back in session and the busy summer season here at the Lighthouse begins to slow down a little bit. The Society has had a great year, and with the restoration of the Keeper's Dwelling accomplished, we've had some time to fine-tune operations and to plan for the future. The new museum has been reopened for just over a year now, and the fine-tuning is paying off. July admissions to the Lighthouse broke all records, generating almost $50,000 during the month. It's really been quite a summer. But even more exciting than that, we've received some of the best reviews we've ever had on TripAdvisor. And I would like to share this one that we received on July 27th. Nicest lighthouse facility I've visited. We took the tour and were absolutely amazed at this entire facility. We've toured 5 or 6 lighthouses in Georgia, South Carolina, and North Carolina, and this is by far the best. Don't waste your time elsewhere, as this place is a 15 on a 10 scale. We didn't pay these people. The lighthouse itself is well preserved and easily accessible. The keeper's house is fresh out of the 1890s. The gift shop was wonderful. Plus, there's plenty of parking, even though the facility is right downtown. If you like lighthouses or simply enjoy history, this is a must-see place. So we're going to aim for the same caliber of reviews at our new World War II museum down at the Coast Guard Station. Next, I would like to thank our sponsors, Wells Fargo Advisors, who generously help us present this series. When I approached Kevin Lokey 5 years ago now, he loved the idea of supporting an educational series for the community, and he's been a loyal supporter ever since. So I would like to ask Kevin, Marion Moore, and Nina Brady to please stand up. They're all here from Wells Fargo Advisors. Will you please join me in thanking them? Now, you all probably know that this is the Society's 50th anniversary. So in celebration of this important milestone, we have planned some very special events for November. We're thrilled to have the award-winning biographer, Richard Brookhiser, here for a lecture and book signing. We're also going to have a members-only cocktail reception with Steve Penley, and we're also providing a free day to our museums for the community with themed tours, special activities, performances, and games. The details of all of these events will be in the fall newsletter, so please watch out for it. The topic for this summer's Chautauqua Lectures also relates to our 50th anniversary. What better way is there to celebrate our golden anniversary, but with a focus on our island's historic icon, the St. Simon's Lighthouse. In addition to it being a fascinating part of our local history, our lighthouse connects us to national and even international events. We wanted the first lecture to have a totally local focus. So tonight, I have the pleasure of introducing Tyler Bagwell, who will bring to life some of the most interesting figures in our past. And he'll also give us a glimpse of life as it was on St. Simon's during the 19th century. Tyler is an assistant professor of communication at the College of Coastal Georgia, and he spent nearly 20 years researching and writing about our local history. Tyler told me that since his childhood, he's had a passion for coastal history, and particularly the people who have made that history. He first concentrated on Jekyll Island and the Jekyll Island Club years, which resulted in the publication of 2 books. His research has expanded beyond Jekyll to the events and the people of Brunswick and St. Simon's, especially around the turn of the century. So tonight, Tyler's going to combine this knowledge of social history with stories of our very own lighthouse keepers. So please help me welcome Tyler Bagwell.
Now, many of you might recognize this painting. It's a gentleman that was called John Cooper. And the St. Simon's Island Land Trust has protected where his plantation was once located on the north end of the island. Now, Mr. Cooper operated a plantation, cotton. He did a number of other crops, but what most people don't realize is that he was also a merchant. And in fact, he and another plantation owner named James Hamilton, if you're familiar with the Epworth by the Sea area, that was where the Hamilton plantation was located. They had a company called Cooper and Hamilton, operated out of the Hamilton plantation. And in the late 1700s, they would actually import in from London supplies. And in particular, some of you might know that one of the things they would bring over were slaves. You ever heard the story about Ebo Landing? John Cooper was a part of that with Spalding on Sapelo Island, and that happened in 1803. We know that there's limited information, but it looks like Cooper was a part of that. But he was bringing supplies over to sell to the recent European immigrants living along the coast. Now, he also was supplying Indian traders up the rivers. Now, this is how it worked. When his partner, who at this time, James Hamilton, was living in London in the late 1700s, he would actually send a letter letting him know that, hey, I'm sending a ship with supplies, and it should arrive roughly on this date. And Mr. Cooper would, in preparation, kind of roughly know, oh, this is the time it's going to arrive. And so he had an 8-oared rowboat, and with 8 slaves, he would literally go for days up and down the coast here looking for that ship. In fact, we know on one occasion, and keep in mind, there wasn't a pilot to guide the boats coming into this area. So what did you do? You would have to go and search for that boat and then bring them into the island. Now, on one occasion, we know, and this is from a story based in 1880, that was written about in 1880 in the newspaper, and in this case, he was taking his 8-oared boat out, and it took days to find the ship that was supposed to come in with supplies. Now, when it eventually arrived, it was the evening, and so he took 7 of his servants and boarded the ship with the plans of in the morning they would guide them in here to Hamilton Plantation. He asked one of his servants, whose name was Glasgow, to stay that evening on the boat. Keep in mind that this was a fairly large rowboat and had supplies to survive for days out when searching for a ship. Well, it was a little rough that night with the seas, and by the morning, what they discovered was that Glasgow had disappeared. And it looked like the rope had broken in the night. Now you can just imagine John Cooper must have been livid discovering this. Now, it was mentioned earlier, yes, I've been interested in the history of Glenn County for over 20 years. In fact, I've authored over 25 magazine and journal articles related to the history of St. Simons, Brunswick, and Jekyll Island. Tonight I want to talk, though, about the lighthouse keepers. And in particular, the first half of my presentation, I'd like to share a little bit about the first lighthouse. And I'll talk about a couple of the lighthouse keepers. In particular, I want to talk about James Gould, who constructed the lighthouse. And then second, I want to talk about a man named Lachlan McIntosh. And I'll briefly mention some information about his son, whose name was Alexander. I want to talk about what happened to that first lighthouse. And then I want to focus our attention on the second lighthouse and the lighthouse keepers. In particular, not to confuse everybody, there were 5 lighthouse keepers I want to talk about from the late 1880s, or 1870s, 80s, and 90s. And I'll wrap up with another lighthouse keeper near the end from 1907 to the 1930s. Last name was Svensson. But to begin, I think it's important for everyone to understand that there was roughly 14 plantations, cotton, but certainly they were also growing other crops here on the island. And in fact, James Gould's great-granddaughter described what her uncle, Horace Gould, used to say about the island. And basically, I quote, "Cotton fields extended on each side of the main road of the island from north to south, and as far as the east and west as the eye could reach the fields, which were colored in white, pink and red from the changing color of the balloons. So we know from this map, it doesn't look entirely like St. Simon's accuracy, but you can get an idea. This is the south end, Retreat Plantation here, and of course this was Mr. Cooper's, Cannon's Point, located here. Right next to him was Hampton, owned by Mr. Butler. Now, I want to begin by talking about a gentleman named James Gould. Now, Mr. Gould, born around 1760 or in the early 1760s, and when he was around the age of 10, his father was a military officer in Massachusetts for the Colonial Army. He studied in Maine civil engineering, and we know that he obtained a contract up in New York to survey a railroad. And this was a railroad that was going to go from Rochester up to Rochester to Buffalo. Very successful, and he obtained another government contract, but this time it was to survey timber down on the St. Mary's River, the Florida side. Well, following that survey job, he decided he was going to stay down along the St. Mary's River and have a go at the timber industry. We know that in 1804, James Gould actually had a business trip up in Charleston, and that's where he met his wife, Jane. Now, Jane's father had been an officer in the British Colonial Army, and by the late 1700s was actually operating a cotton plantation somewhere in the vicinity of Savannah. Now, he and Jane married, and they started having children, and they lived and operated a plantation for several years down on the St. Mary's River. However, in 1807, we know that there was an Indian uprising, and there's accounts that the Gould family, with 2 young children at that time, fled to Savannah, where Jane's mother and father were also operating a plantation. And it was at that time that James Gould discovered that the government was looking for someone to help construct a lighthouse on St. Simon's Island. And we know that he obtained the job to build the lighthouse. Now, many of you probably have seen this photograph of, excuse me, I'll show you a photograph in a minute. This is James Gould taken in a painting probably done in the 1840s, but I'm not quite sure of the date. We know that in the early years, after the construction of the lighthouse, Mr. Gould lived in the dwelling. But in a few years, he decided he would also get involved with a plantation, and he bought a large tract of land in the center of St. Simon's Island. You might have heard of it. Sometimes it's called the St. Clair Tract. Incidentally, he also eventually bought Black Banks, the beautiful live oaks there, with the hope of enticing his oldest son and staying there with his wife. Eventually, his second oldest son, named Horace, purchased the land from him and operated a plantation in that location. Now, we know that Mr. Gould would often travel by stagecoach up to New York for business. And from my understanding, this is when this painting was most likely completed. If you're not familiar with, you would have taken most likely a boat to Brunswick. From there, you would have boarded the stagecoach. We know by 1830, the stagecoach departed from a hotel called the Oglethorpe House. And from there, it would take you up to Darien, and the roads were pretty good all the way up to New York, but it took weeks to travel. And we know that Mr. Gould would oftentimes take a desk with him, a carriage desk, I think is what you would call it. It was mahogany, it had brass edges on it, and we know that it had a secret compartment where he would hide his gold. And so we know he would travel back and forth. Now, this is an image of that first lighthouse. Mr. Gould, probably we think, the lower base was made out of tabby that came from the ruins of Fort Frederica. And around that time period, we also know that there were probably about 15 or 16 houses that were once on the island that was also taking tabby out of Fort Frederica and building chimneys and fireplaces out of them. I would be surprised if any of those still exist. About 75 feet in height before you got to the light, and I think it was roughly 85 feet total. Now, the lighthouse keeper's home, and this is a map that you can see it was actually overlooking the ocean. So here we have the lighthouse. It says in ruins because this would have been a drawing from the 1860s. And to be quite honest, I have no idea what these two parts of the dwelling would have been. But by the 1820s, he wasn't living in that house. He had his own house at St. Clair, the plantation. Now, 1852, Mr. Gould decided it was time to retire and had stepped down, but he was still, as a lighthouse keeper, but he was still operating his plantation. I think I just said 1852 was the year he died. This was in 1837. To replace him was another lighthouse keeper. And this is a photograph of a gentleman named Lachlan McIntosh. Now, this is from the 1880s, and he operated the plant. He was a lighthouse keeper from basically 1837 until about 1852. Now, you probably have heard the name Lachlan McIntosh before, but this is not the famous Lachlan McIntosh that had the duel with Button Gwinnett. Now, they were probably distant cousins, but this Lachlan McIntosh was the grandson of a man named Donald McIntosh, who as a young man had actually came into Darien as one of the Scottish Highlanders. Incidentally, his grandmother was also a McIntosh, but related to a General McIntosh from South Carolina. Again, not a close relative of the famous Lachlan McIntosh, who, by the way, also owned a plantation on the island for many years. Actually, it was his son. Right after the American Revolution, anybody that was supporting the British government, they pretty much had their land confiscated. And that was the case not only with James Gould, his opportunity to buy St. Clair, as well as Black Bank's plantation. They had been confiscated, and he purchased them from a bank up in Savannah. Well, Lachlan McIntosh, the distant cousin, but not the gentleman that was a lighthouse keeper, did the same thing. He obtained a plantation, and then he gave it to his son to operate in probably close to Frederica area today. Now, Lachlan McIntosh was born in McIntosh County, and in fact had a plantation there. And we know that when he retired, that's where he moved to. And he had 11 children with his wife. And the second oldest son became the next lighthouse keeper. And his name was Alexander. And again, this is a photograph probably from the early 1900s, not 100% positive of the exact date. Keep in mind, he was 22 years old when he was the third lighthouse keeper. And he only did that position for a few years. He would go on and move after a few years and also live in McIntosh County. Now, what happened to the old lighthouse? There was another lighthouse keeper. In fact, I know of two others. Unfortunately, we don't have photographs of them, or at least not yet. But what we do know is what happened to the old lighthouse. Now, Civil War, 1861, we know that probably around 1,500 Confederate soldiers were stationed in Glenn County. Now, some of them were in Brunswick, and I know that there was actually a hospital, a Confederate hospital, located on Newcastle Street. There were also soldiers bivouacking on Jekyll Island. They actually had 2 batteries stationed there. But on St. Simon's, they were also bivouacking. In fact, we know that there was an artillery division coming from Macon that actually the officers started to use as headquarters the dwelling of the lighthouse, and that they were using the old lighthouse initially as a magazine storage. This is a close-up of a map circa 1861, maybe early 1860s. And with this, we can see here is the lighthouse. This would have been the first lighthouse. And then you'll see really listed here, Fort Brown. That was where the Confederate soldiers bivouacked here on the island. Now, in 1862, however, there was an order to evacuate the coast. And one of those key orders was to destroy the lighthouse to avoid the U.S. Navy from using it to navigate into the area. I've heard two stories. One is that the Glen Guard, which was a Confederate unit that went on to fight in Fredericksburg and some other major battles. One was that they took dynamite and blew up that first lighthouse. And again, this was to avoid, and they removed prior to that the lenses from that lighthouse. The other story I heard that it was a Confederate gunboat over practicing. No idea which is the real story, but we do know that, hey, they destroyed it. Now, during this time period, the families that lived on the island, they all moved into around the Wayne County area. Not all in that area, but for the most part, we know many escaped. Some tried to bring their belongings with them. Others left belongings in their houses thinking, oh, this will be over soon, and we'll just come back and everything will be great. We know they weren't on the island again until probably 1866, many of those families. So, with the ordered evacuation of the Confederates here on the island, what we do know about this is that when the Union Navy landed in Brunswick, one of the key things they were doing was they were going to look for the lenses from the lighthouse. I'd like to share with you a quote. Now, this is dated March of 1862. It was from a letter by a Lieutenant Balch, who was serving in the U.S. Navy. And he said, "We hoisted the American flag on the Oglethorpe House and offered and posted a proclamation, but we did not discover any trace of the lenses for the lighthouse for which you directed our search." And that was from a letter dated 1862. Now, the Oglethorpe House was actually built in 1837. It was the spot to socialize. Typically, you would find the plantation owners would go over and enjoy dinner at the Oglethorpe House. And you might have heard about the duel between, or it wasn't much of a duel, but with Thomas Hazard, who owned West Point Plantation, and another young Alexander Wiley. And that actually took place in 1837 in this hotel that was downtown in Brunswick. For any of you who remember the Oglethorpe Hotel, this was located where the Oglethorpe Hotel was eventually placed. And now, of course, it's where the discussion has been to put a convention center there, perhaps in the future. Now, real quick, I'll tell you what happened with, they were Hazard and Wiley. Wiley's father had passed away and had the village plantation. And they were arguing over property boundaries. They ran into each other, and young Henry Dubinion, whose grandfather had purchased Jekyll Island, worked hard to break them up. They were about to fight in the front porch. Well, 10 or 15 minutes later, they came back, and Alexander Wiley spit in Dr. Hazard's face. Dr. Hazard pulled out a gun and shot him in the heart. And before Wiley died, he popped him in the head with his cane. That ended that. We know that this structure was still in existence in the early 1860s. I was told, and I've seen several accounts, that what happened to it was that sometime in 1863 or 1864, a group of Confederate soldiers were stationed there that were not affiliated with the community, and they haphazardly started a fire in the fireplace, didn't watch over it. The building caught fire, and of course, was no more. 1866, we know that the U.S. government had a gentleman stationed here to make sure that all former slaves, whenever they did labor, they were to be paid. Life had changed. Many of the families tried to grow cotton. Cotton wasn't successful because we know by the early 1870s, prices had dropped, and there were some other challenges. A spider had come through at one time and damaged the bolls, and some other diseases. And pretty much by the late 1870s, we know that the main crop wasn't cotton anymore here. It was actually products like corn, potatoes, squash. Now, we know that plans were made to build the second lighthouse right in the same location as the first lighthouse. Now, this is an image from probably early 1872. Now, what I like about this, notice here to the right, this is the base of the old lighthouse. So you could still see that part of it was here when they were constructing. Now, I think it's also interesting, looking at this close-up, it was built most likely by former slaves or children of slaves that were from St. Simon's Island. And you can see a picture here, and on the upper part as well, you'll see that all of the people who primarily built the second lighthouse were African Americans. Now, as we go into the second lighthouse, I don't want to overwhelm you with names because we had back-to-back 5 different lighthouse keepers during a short time period. What we do know, typically, and this is actually a picture from 1910s, and this is of a later lighthouse keeper. I'll talk about him shortly, Mr. Svensson. But I wanted everybody to get an idea of what a lighthouse keeper's uniform looked like. Now, typically the buttons had on them USLHI, which stood for United States Lighthouse Institute. They were navy blue, and typically as a lighthouse keeper, you were issued 3 of these uniforms. Now, the hat, also navy blue, included an image of a lighthouse. And as we can see here from the early 1910s, maybe 1890s, excuse me, this is a picture from 1890s with this. Now, before I start talking about some of these other lighthouse keepers, I want to kind of set the scene here. We know that by 1870, that there was a man named, last name of Dodge, Anson Phelps Dodge. You probably are familiar with his son. He rebuilt Christ Church. Well, Mr. Dodge and some partners had invested in lumber. And in fact, we know that 3 South Georgia counties, probably about 100,000 acres, was owned by the Georgia Land and Lumber Company. And by 1875, the old Hamilton Plantation, Epworth by the Sea today, was actually where we had the mill. Now, this is a bad image, but it kind of gives you the idea and the importance of a lighthouse in this community. By 1881, we had on average 100 sailing vessels coming in monthly. What were they getting? Lumber. Lumber from these areas were rafted down the Altamaha River, and then they would mill this lumber, and on average, we're talking about one year, they had something like 150 million feet of lumber milled, and then the ships came from Portugal, Spain, England, Germany, would load up at the docks, and then it would transport out. So you can definitely see the need, the importance of having a lighthouse by this time. Now, to get to the island was by boat still. And in fact, this, probably never heard of Chapman's Wharf. Chapman's Wharf was another dock that was located on the island. Most people are familiar with what we sometimes hear called the Ocean Pier. That really wasn't around, I'm guessing, by the 1880s, definitely 1891 it was there, but I really think it was earlier. There were 3 docks that the David Clark was what this steamship was called, and it would make 2 trips weekly, round trips, from Brunswick to Savannah. And on its way up through the river, Frederica River, it would make 3 stops. One of those, of course, was at the lumber mill. They had a dock located there. The second was located up at Frederica. It was the Frederica dock. And the third was called Chapman's Wharf, which is the image that we're seeing here, which is further north. I'm not quite sure exactly. I've seen a map, probably in the Butler Plantation area, somewhere in that vicinity on the left is my guess with this. So 1870s, 1880s, hey, this was how you still moved around with boats. Now, first lighthouse keeper, 1872 to 1874, just 2 years here. Bradford Brunt was his name. We don't know a lot about him, but we do know his salary was $600 a year. It's the second lighthouse keeper of the second lighthouse that we have some more information about, and his name was Frederick Osborne. Now, he was originally from England. In fact, his wife was from Ireland, and their first child was born in the lighthouse dwelling probably around 1875. Apparently, it was a heavy storm the night that this child was born. Now, here's where you've probably heard Frederick Osborne's name. By the way, they had assistant lighthouse keepers. And in the lighthouse dwelling, the first floor was for the lighthouse keeper, the primary. The assistant lighthouse keeper and their family typically stayed on the second floor. Well, in the late 1870s, when Frederick Osborne was the primary keeper, one of his assistants was a man named John Stevens. And the story goes as follows. In 1880, they were having an argument in the front of the keeper's dwelling. And as the story goes, it was about chickens. Now, let me tell you, both of these men were well respected and liked by members of the community. In later years, people wished that they had intervened and been around to stop what was about to happen. Now, apparently, John Stevens was accusing Mr. Osborne of stealing his chickens. Mr. Osborne claimed that, no, that's not the case. And in fact, it got so heated that when John Stevens was coming at him in front of the keeper's dwelling, Mr. Osborne pulled out a pistol and said, if you come at me and attack me, I'll shoot you. Well, John Stevens probably walked up the stairs to his part of the dwelling, pulled out a shotgun, came back down, and from about 80 feet away, shot and killed Mr. Frederick Osborne. People were sad. Everyone liked both of them. And, of course, Mr. Stevens lost his job, and immediately to replace them, go figure, was a gentleman named George Asbell. Now, Mr. Asbell was born in Brunswick, and so he was very familiar with the community. And his wife was actually his assistant. Now, keep in mind, this was a lot of work. Not only were you maintaining that light, they were keeping the dwelling and the lighthouse and the grounds pristine. And you hear descriptions of how beautiful the lighthouse is and the gorgeous whitewashing taking place. So you can imagine it was a lot of work. But keep in mind, still at this time, this area was isolated. You still had the King family that owned Retreat Plantation, which you could even see from this area, unless you were up in the lighthouse, I can imagine. And the Postels had a plantation going, I'm bad with directions, was it west? No, excuse me, east. Am I thinking right? I think you understand what I'm trying to get. So it was very isolated, agrarian still. And we know that oftentimes the lighthouse keepers, like Asbell, would, after they did their duties, they planted a garden, growing corn, as I mentioned. I've even seen cabbage listed as a crop. Turnips was another crop. And so, very busy. So not only were they maintaining the lighthouse, they were also growing food. And some of them loved to hunt as well. Mr. Asbell was young. He was 28. And after a few years, he decided, hey, I'm going to go work for the police force in Brunswick. So he and his wife retired from this job and moved on to Brunswick to another career. This is when a gentleman named Isaac Peckham came into the scene. Now, Mr. Peckham had been a lighthouse keeper on Cumberland Island. Many of you have possibly seen on the north end of Little Cumberland. There's a lighthouse there. Well, Mr. and Miss Peckham lived there. And just to give you an idea, now this is talking about the Cumberland Island Lighthouse, but I think it's very relevant because it actually coincides because the same thing was similar to our lighthouse here. And I quote, this is from an article from 1882. It was actually talking about the Cumberland Island Hotel, no longer in existence. It's actually parts of it are still there, but it's privately owned. And the writer, Angela Davis, I quote, "The thing that struck me most forcibly was the cleanliness of everything. The lighthouse is certainly the most spotless place that has been discovered. Everything is painted, whitewashed, scrubbed, and scoured to the utmost extent." Now, this was talking about Mr. Peckham on Cumberland Island, but it was very relevant to here as well. Now, Isaac Peckham was born in Pennsylvania and had worked for a time at various lighthouses. The last before coming to St. Simon's was the Cumberland Island Lighthouse. And his wife was also his assistant lighthouse keeper. Now, I want to talk for a minute about Dora Peckham, Mr. Peckham's wife. She's interesting. She was born in Brunswick, but her mother was born in St. Augustine. And interesting, her grandmother was also a lighthouse keeper. Her grandfather had taken over the St. Augustine Lighthouse. And sadly, and I think this was around the 1850s, it was definitely before the Civil War, he was up whitewashing the lighthouse down in St. Augustine. Scaffolding didn't support him correctly, and sadly, he fell to his death. Well, his wife, Maria, was given charge of taking over as the full-time lighthouse keeper, which is very interesting because Maria, her grandmother, was the first Hispanic-American woman to be in the Coast Guard, or in that case, it was the lighthouse service. We think of it today as the Coast Guard. So she came from a family that had been involved with helping maintain lighthouses since she was a child. Now, all accounts in the 1880s was that she was a great shot. And the claim was that she was the best shooter on the island. Now, I know at one occasion she shot a 10-foot alligator right on the beach, right here in front of the lighthouse. And Mr. Peckham declared that he was going to stuff it and display it for everyone to see. Another occasion, she shot a blue heron and made what they identified in the newspapers as a chicken pie. Another occasion, she had shot so many seabirds that she decided to take all of the plumes and sell them. You could buy them for $10. She was a hard worker. Everybody talked about how she was very thin, feminine, yet very strong. And she was the assistant lighthouse keeper here. And like I mentioned Asbel earlier, they also planted in between doing their job. And in fact, Mr. Peckham actually bought land from the Postels right near the lighthouse. And so he would do his gardening or farming in between. He didn't have too far to go. Now, the Peckhams were here until 1892, and then they decided that they would focus on primarily farming, but I'm sure they were involved in other endeavors as well. And we know that by that time, we saw a gentleman named Joseph Champagne take over. This is actually an image of the lighthouse circa late 1910s. I wanted to share this because this is actually a postcard proof, and some of you might have seen the hand-colored postcard of this. There's still a number of copies around. If you're not familiar, the Glover brothers printed a number of scenes of St. Simon's Island. This was one of those. And up in New York, they would hire mainly women at the time to paint these scenes. So they took a photograph, reproduced it, and then they would hand color these. And that's where you see the hand colored around. What I like about this is because if you look closely, this is a pond and a cow. And as I mentioned earlier, the main lighthouse keeper was on the first floor. Second floor was generally for the assistant lighthouse keeper. Now, Joseph Champagne, like Asbel and Peckham, his assistant was his wife, and her name was Abby. Now, Joseph was still earning pretty much what a lighthouse keeper would have earned at that time, which was $600 a year, $50 a month, or something to that effect. His wife was earning $450 a year. Now, I want to talk for a moment about the 1890s, because we really started seeing a change. For most of the early years, this was an isolated area. However, what we see is that development started coming at this time period, by the 1880s, particularly tourism. Now, this is the dock that we're sometimes called the Ocean Pier, and we know the vicinity of this today. This is the City of Brunswick steamer coming in. I believe, and I might not be 100% correct on this, I think that this dock was initially, land was purchased a small amount from the King family, who owned Retreat Plantation, and Jake Dart built this, or someone in the Dart family constructed this, I think in the 1880s. I know by 1891 it was definitely in existence. And we noticed that King City was being developed by this time. The King family had taken the area that we think of as the business district, or sometimes I've heard it called as the business district nearby. They started breaking up part of the plantation and selling off the property. Now you will notice right here, this is railroad ties, because in the 1880s, we know that, or in really late 1870s, we started seeing hotels constructed right on the beach. Now, one of the first ones that I'm aware of was created by a woman named Annie Arnold. In fact, she was a Stevens who lived up in Frederica. And she created the Ocean View Hotel. Her husband was German, excellent craftsman, and they operated by 1884, I don't know if it was the first, but it was definitely one of the first hotels on the beach. Purchased property from the Postel family. But probably the most magnificent hotel at this time was the St. Simon's Hotel. This was pretty much, if you're familiar with Massengale Park, this was located in Massengale Park. And it was grand. So in the summertime, this was when this hotel was operational. And they would literally take the railroad, and in fact, Beachview Drive, as you think of it, a good portion of that was for the railroad. And of course, they removed that in 1927, and that's when we really got Beachview Drive as we think of it today. So this is an interesting hotel because it was built around 1886, the same time that the famous Oglethorpe Hotel was built in Brunswick. Now, this is a picture from the 1910s of the Oglethorpe Hotel. I mentioned earlier about the Oglethorpe House. After it burned for a few years, the area was just empty, but eventually they built the Oglethorpe Hotel. Now, why I'm mentioning the Oglethorpe Hotel? Because in the winter, furnishings were used in the Oglethorpe Hotel. In the summer, or actually in the late spring, they would take all of this furniture, bring it over by boat, and then put it inside the St. Simon's Hotel. A lot of work, you can imagine. Now, unfortunately, the St. Simon's Hotel burned in the late 1890s, and a few years later, they built the new St. Simon's Hotel in that vicinity. It also burned by the late 1910s, and they moved it to another location. So, I mentioned Joseph Champagne, who was here up until 1907 with his wife. This is a great photograph that, from my understanding, Mr. Albert Fendig has donated to the Coastal Georgia Historical Society. I think his grandfather's in the picture, but I'm not sure where. But what I do know is that this is Mr. Champagne. And you can see, again, in his uniform, and this is his wife, assistant lighthouse keeper. I thought it was interesting, he's wearing his hat. Now, we also know that he was an artist, and I've seen this copy of a painting made by Mr. Joseph Champagne. I think it's interesting. It's possibly hard to see here, but you can see here's a steamship, here's the lighthouse, and then here's a sailing vessel coming in. It was also around 1896 under Mr. Champagne that they actually added the second beacon to help navigate in. I want to mention something for a minute. The lumber company that I had talked about had brought in so many jobs. In fact, that was identified as the main area of the island for many years. They had pretty much taken out hundreds of thousands of acres of pristine timber, 3 counties not too far away from here. They had taken all the resources, and that was signal of the demise of the lumber industry here. Closed down, but there was still a lot of traffic taking place, and it was still very important to have a lighthouse. Now, by this time, what we see is that ships were coming into Brunswick. This is a 6-masted schooner docked in Brunswick, probably 1910s, hand-colored. Now, what were they exporting out? Ships were coming from all over the world, just like they were doing initially for the lumber on St. Simon's. And what they were exporting out in our community was, of course, lumber, railroad ties, and naval stores. Now, naval stores is a collective name that, in essence, it was turpentine and rosin. And rosin was used on wooden ships to caulk and protect. So you could make a wooden vessel last a lot longer if you use the tar. And this is downtown Brunswick. This is actually, if you look up on the left, this is the Oglethorpe Hotel. So you get an idea. Barrels from the Downing Company. And they had barrel makers, and they would literally make these barrels to put in the rosin and, of course, turpentine as well. And this was actually created all around the county. And they would bring it in, it was through a distillation process that you would heat up, and that's how you would make, very much like making corn liquor, except for in this case, you're taking the resin, the rosin from the trees and distilling it. And so for many years, we were, at one time, the second largest exporter in the United States of naval stores. Now, it wasn't just these type of products that we needed vessels and we needed guidance to come in, but boat travel was still prevalent. Now, this is the dock of the Mallory Steamship Line in downtown Brunswick. Now, the Mallory Steamship Line started operating in this area in the 1880s, and it actually, 11 vessels would move back and forth, starting in New York, go along the coast, down Florida, and up and over to Texas. And they would move back and forth on a regular basis. So you could take a ship from New York and get down here in about a day and a half or close to 2 days and arrive in Brunswick. You could see the stevedores, and they would not only just bring passengers, but they would also have products and things that would ship around as well. Now, by 1907, we had a new lighthouse keeper, and his name was Carl Svensson. Now, Mr. Svensson had been at the Jupiter Lighthouse in Florida. He'd also been at the Charleston Lighthouse as well. And family was from Norway, and apparently he was born on his father's boat right off the coast of England. Well, he and his family lived here for many years, 1907 to about 1934. And Mr. Svensson and his family is where we first hear the ghost stories of the lighthouse. Now, Mr. Svensson's wife, as I understand the story, and I might have it slightly off, one evening she was preparing dinner for her husband to come down from the lighthouse, and she swore she heard footsteps, and the door opened. Their dog, Jinx, apparently bristled, getting up, and then a breeze came through, and he just started barking and looking like something was coming through. Miss Vinson was shocked, and she just swore it was a ghost, and she went up to tell her husband in the lighthouse. And apparently over their 28-year tenure, this happened not just once, but several times they would claim that they would feel or see a ghost walking around. And they believed that it was Frederick Osborne. Now, I've never seen a ghost there, but I've heard other people tell me that story as well, and it comes from the Svensson family. 1915, they were still the lighthouse keeping family here. And we know a lot of changes were taking place. I talked a little bit earlier about a gentleman named Alexander McIntosh, the son of Lachlan McIntosh, who I mentioned for a few years had been a lighthouse keeper. Well, it was in 1915 that he would pass away in McIntosh County. It was also in 1915 that we saw a major remodel of the lighthouse dwelling. And in fact, they had this center that it looks like they divided the dwelling into. So instead of having the upstairs assistant lighthouse keeper downstairs, it was pretty much like two apartments. This was no longer an isolated lighthouse station. And this is a picture, I'm thinking from the 1910s, looking down at what has sometimes been called the Waycross Colony. Back in 1891, there was about a little over an acre of land that had been sold to a gentleman. His last name was Murphy, I don't know his first name, who bought this land, and then he subdivided it up, and it was turned into basic cottages, no electricity, no bathrooms. And this was alongside the lighthouse up until about 1935. And that's when apparently a fire took place and burned. It could have been 34, but somewhere in the 1930s, a fire caught place, and the county eventually purchased the land. And of course, this is part of the Neptune Small Park area today. Now, it was also in 1915 that I want to return to a minute to a man named George Asbell. I brought him up and talked about how he, for many years, was an early lighthouse keeper of the 1880s. He, by this time, had worked his career as a police officer in Brunswick. And a sad situation took place. There was a man who was named Monroe Phillips. He was a real estate investor. And for whatever reason, he had lost a lot of money in 1915. And he was irate, he was angry, and he was going to get back at one of his former partners who was an attorney here, Henry Dunwoody. Well, he walked into his office with a shotgun, and before he had a chance to say anything, he shot him in the face and killed him. Sadly, it didn't stop there. He then walked downstairs and out to Newcastle Street and just started shooting people that had gathered because they had heard the sound of the shotgun. Shot in the front of him, shot in the distance, and sadly, right across in the distance was George Asbell. Killed him. And also right next to Mr. Asbell was a gentleman by the last name of Levison. Not to go into too great a detail, you're probably familiar with Levison. Sometimes you'll hear an area called Jewtown. There were 3 areas that are traditionally African American. Well, it was really called Edgewood, but we oftentimes call it Jewtown. Now that's because the 2 Levison brothers, before they set up shop in Brunswick, operated a store there. And they were well loved, really liked. And it was European descent, African descent families built up around their store. And hence, sometimes people would tease and say, oh, it's the Jewtown. But it was really, they were very good friends. Levisons were well liked, but the real name of that area was called Edgewood. Other region was Harrington, which are going up towards Fort Frederica, and then parts of the South End was another area where descendants of the former slaves all gathered. Now, this is an image from probably 1917, but close to that time period. So, this irate person came out and was just camping out, shooting people as they came outdoors. Wounded 20 people, killed 5. And finally, there was another attorney, last name was Butts, ran to the hardware store, pulled out a pistol, loaded it, and he was wounded. He'd already been shot by this crazy person. Went out, aimed, shot, and killed him in the street. But sadly, George Asbell, an early lighthouse keeper, never survived and died. So, by the way, by that time, this area was developed. We didn't have the causeway until 1924, but really what was referred to as King City was developed, or as we call it oftentimes today, the village. This is the picture of the third St. Simon's Hotel, far cry from the one that was constructed here in 1886. Actually, it was called the Bellevue for a time before they changed the name. And this was around 1915 as well. This location is the dock or the ocean pier that we're familiar with today. It burned, and in its place in the early 1920s, to coincide with the building of the new causeway, they also constructed what they were calling the casino. I've heard that the breezes were wonderful and people enjoyed going out and courting and drinking soft Coca-Colas in this location. By the way, I want to tell you a story, just an aside, before I get back to the lighthouse keepers. I was good friends with a gentleman for many years in the early 1990s, and his name was Larry Baker. In my research on the Jekyll Island Club, I met a lot of different former members and their children. Well, Larry Baker lived in Palm Beach, but he would travel up, even in his mid and late 80s. He would drive up and spend the night on Jekyll Island. At this time, the clubhouse had been beautifully restored. And he would call me up, and we would get together, usually for a drink in the evenings, and he would tell me stories. And his father had been Davis Cup, lawn tennis association, and was very good friends with a number of the Jekyll Island Club members who were avid tennis players. And we would sit down, and he told me a story one day. He goes, you know, around 1933, I was at Princeton University, and I was with two good friends. One of those was John F. Kennedy, our future president. And he said they were coming back from Palm Beach one day, and they were going to come over and stay on St. Simon's, or I think Sea Island, the cloister at that time, I think. And, no, St. Simon's. And he told me that they rushed up, and John F. Kennedy started at Princeton. He didn't finish there. The next year, he went to another college. And they attempted, with others, to try to put out the fire. Unfortunately, it burned to the ground. And we know that by this time, it's starting to get to a point where you really don't need lighthouse keepers. Now, Mr. Svensson had passed away around 1934, 1935, and they had a couple of other lighthouse keepers, but by 1953, the lighthouse was automated. This is a picture of the village circa 1948. And so you can imagine, by this time, the car was the thing. This is a view from the early 1950s, and if you look closely, it's hard to see, but these are all cars parked on the beach. This right here is the King and Prince Hotel. And by the way, behind the King and Prince for many years was the Arnold House. I've seen photographs where it was still in existence in the 1950s, but I find it interesting, that's accretion, because originally the Arnold House Hotel, or the Ocean View Hotel as it was generally referred to, was right on the beach. However, by this time, there was enough land developed there that the King and Prince was able to develop, though we know that this area has lost here. So in the early 1970s, we know that the Coastal Georgia Historical Society, which had been formed in 1965, it's great to sell it 50 years, it's great, painstakingly restored the old lighthouse keeper. Certainly they've done a lot of work periodically since then. But we know by the late 1970s, it was looking great. I can remember in the early 80s, I thought it was 1980, but it might have been later than that, I can remember coming over from Jekyll Island to go and check out the view from the lighthouse. So to wrap up here, I've kind of taken us on a journey, and I hope it wasn't too confusing. I began by first talking about our first lighthouse, shared some stories about James Gould, as well as the second lighthouse keeper, who was Lachlan McIntosh, and his son Alexander McIntosh after him. Talked about what happened to that first lighthouse. And then I went in the second half talking about our second lighthouse. I talked about some of those early 1880s, 1890s lighthouse keepers, Osborne, Asbel, Peckham, Champagne, and then last I talked about the Svensson family. So John Cooper in the 1880s must have been livid without having a lighthouse here or even pilot boats to help guide people in to the Hamilton plantation. And we know certainly he must have been irate about losing this 8-oared rowboat as well as his servant Glasgow. Well, we do know what happened to them. Glasgow, who had been born on St. Simon's, had family here, was eventually found out to sea by a ship who helped them get back to, get to London, where James Hamilton helped him return to his family. But certainly that must have been one of the key reasons why John Cooper donated for $1 the 4 acres of land with the lighthouse as we see it today. And with this, I'll stop if anybody would like to ask questions or comments. Yes, yes.
So Svensson was the last flight?
No, he was not. There were, from my understanding, 2 other lighthouse keepers before that. But definitely by 1953, there was no need to have lighthouse keepers by that time. It was automated with that. Yes, sir.
What was the light before electricity and before gas?
Okay, from my understanding, for the first lighthouse, I know one of the things used was lard, because then they switched to kerosene or some type of mineral spirits in 1881. We know that chains hung down, and I think it's lard, but I'm not 100% positive. And whale oil certainly would have been. Whale oil would have been used for burning. Other questions or comments?
What year was those big gun emplacements put up around the lighthouse and on?
Now, you're talking about the second time, 1898. I think you're talking the Spanish-American War. What we found in 1898, there was a whole fear that the Spanish were going to invade us. And so further down from the ocean pier, they had set up 2 or 3 parrot cannons. They'd also set them up on the north end of Jekyll Island and the south end of Jekyll Island. They were never used, even though they were constructed, and pretty much were dismantled by 1899 or 1900. However, I do know that Mr. Downey, who made a fortune in naval stores and had other activities, had a beautiful home downtown Brunswick. He also had a beautiful home that I remember when I was younger. They moved, and I saw it go by barge up somewhere to South Carolina. Perhaps some people remember that. I think it was was it the Fusky? I remember when that happened. He had those cannons up in front of his house. There's claims that he wanted to be a Jekyll Island Club member, and he had a cannon, whether it was one of those 1890 parrot cannons or something else, that he would shoot the cannon so people could see from Jekyll Island. Whether that's true, I don't know, but we do know that the family was well respected and loved in our community with that. So the 1898 cannons had pretty much were only here for a short period, and then they were removed. I know the Jekyll Island cannons went up to a town in South Carolina, and apparently they're still in front of a courthouse up there today. But I'm not quite sure what happened to the cannons that had been stationed here from that 1898. Was that what you were?
Right, I know that he had the military all bivouacked out there too with tents and everything, so I saw a picture of that.
Yes, sir, yes. Definitely, definitely. I saw your hand.
When the lighthouse was destroyed during the Civil War, were the lenses that were removed ever recovered?
No. And I think they went up towards the Atlanta area, but I'm speculating with that. I was told that they really did search for them, but they were never found. And still to this day, we really don't know what happened with those. Oh, yes, sir.
I've heard stories that the range beacons or the towers that are in the sound, you would line them up with the lighthouse to...
Yes, sir. From my understanding, that's how you would navigate. Is that correct? Mimi?
The range, the front range beacon was lower than the lighthouse, so you would set them up when they were exactly one over the other, you knew you were coming in the channel correctly. So now it's those towers back, what would be behind the sound office? There are two, and now it's a shotgun approach. You put the lighthouse between those two range beacons that are out in the sound, sort of going into Frederick River.
Definitely, excellent.
I think you said that the federal government paid for the first one. Did they also put the money out for the second lighthouse, or was it funded in some other way?
Yes. From my understanding, yes, they did finance as well. Mr. Brown.
And the first time I climbed the lighthouse, I came at 11, 8 years old, a barefoot boy came in out of the bright sunshine, and walked in the dark, in the face of the lighthouse, and kicked the first step with my bare foot, and I lived the rest of the way 129.
That's great. Oh, wow. What year would that have been, do you think?
I was in 25.
Wow. 1925. Wow. Other questions, comments? Yes, sir.
Is the lighthouse still in operation, automatic, or?
Yes, a provider, the Coast Guard Auxiliary maintains the lighthouse light today.
The Coastal Georgia Historical Society owns the lighthouse through the federal the National Historic Landmark Preservation Act. We were able to acquire the lighthouse, but the lens is still maintained by the Coast Guard Auxiliary, and it's still an official aid to navigation, which we're very excited. The lens, our lens is it's the same French lens that was put in the lighthouse in 1872. And for the next week, we're going to be, our speaker will be the scholar who wrote a book about the Fresnel lens. And we're really excited about that because she's done a huge amount of research, and she's going to talk about how important the Fresnel lens was to navigation. So we're very fortunate that we have one. There are not a lot of lighthouses that still have their actual lenses in the tower.
I remember the old casino on the first floor they had a couple of bowling alleys there with heads in a little short, and they had a couple of blackboards and hidden boards, and then the old fellow Bill Barrett was the manager of the bowling alley and demolition stand, and somebody came, and he said he was glad when fall came, and the girls had to put on more clothes, and all I could think of, I hope I never get that old.
That's great, that's great. Any other? Thank you, thank you.